The United States is currently experiencing a gradual but persistent increase in domestic fuel prices, a trend that market analysts trace back to a strategic shift in North American energy trade. While the return of tariffs under the Trump administration was intended to pressure trading partners into economic concessions, the response from Canada has avoided public escalation in favor of subtle, market-based adjustments. Rather than implementing retaliatory tariffs or supply cuts, Canadian energy producers have recalibrated pricing formulas, transportation costs, and risk premiums. These changes have begun to ripple through the American economy, particularly affecting the Midwest and Gulf Coast regions, which rely heavily on Canadian crude oil. The situation highlights a structural dependency within the American energy sector. Although the U.S. is a leading global oil producer, its refining infrastructure is specifically optimized for the heavy crude imported from Canada. Because retrofitting these refineries to process lighter domestic oil would require billions of dollars and years of construction, the U.S. market remains tied to Canadian supply, leaving it vulnerable to these quiet pricing shifts. This economic slow squeeze is now manifesting as higher wholesale costs for fuel distributors and tightening margins for industrial operators across the country. As the pricing shifts move downstream, the impact on the American supply chain has become increasingly measurable. Refineries, unable to easily substitute the specific chemical composition of Canadian heavy crude, have largely absorbed rising input costs, which are now being passed to fuel distributors and transportation networks. Diesel fuel has emerged as the primary pressure point in this economic transition. Because diesel powers the majority of the nation's freight trucks, rail systems, and agricultural machinery, the increase in wholesale prices has created a cascading effect on the cost of goods. Logistics companies report that every additional mile of transport is becoming more expensive, forcing a recalculation of shipping rates that affects everything from building materials to grocery staples. In the agricultural sector, the strain is particularly acute. Farmers facing higher operational expenses for machinery and crop transport are seeing their profit margins shrink, a cost that is eventually reflected in consumer food prices. Despite the rising financial pressure, Canadian producers have maintained a steady volume of exports to the United States, ensuring that there are no physical supply disruptions while they maximize the value of their resources under the new tariff framework. This strategy has allowed Canada to remain within the bounds of international trade agreements while demonstrating the leverage inherent in controlling a critical industrial feedstock. For the American consumer, the result is not a sudden price shock, but a persistent erosion of purchasing power as higher energy costs embed themselves into the broader inflationary landscape. International observers and financial institutions are now analyzing this shift as a definitive case study in modern economic statecraft. In Europe, policymakers have noted Canada's reliance on rule-based market mechanisms rather than political rhetoric, viewing the strategy as a blueprint for maintaining stability while protecting national interests. Meanwhile, major Asian energy importers, including Japan and South Korea, are reassessing their own supply chain vulnerabilities, emphasizing the need for diversification to mitigate the risks associated with deep interdependence on a single partner. Within the United States, the situation has sparked an intense policy debate regarding the broad application of tariffs on strategic resources. Critics argue that the rigid nature of energy infrastructure makes such sectors ill-suited for traditional trade pressure, as the lack of immediate domestic alternatives effectively shifts the tax burden onto American industries and consumers. Conversely, proponents of the current trade policy maintain that exceptions could undermine broader negotiating leverage. The long-term consequences of this friction are already visible in corporate strategy, with some firms delaying expansion or restructuring logistics to account for sustained higher energy costs. Canada's measured approach has reinforced its reputation as a disciplined supplier, while the United States faces the challenge of balancing short-term economic stability with the massive capital investment required to achieve true energy independence. As global power dynamics increasingly hinge on the control of non-substitutable resources like heavy crude and critical minerals, this episode underscores that structural dependencies can be more influential than policy declarations. For more updates on the evolving global economy and trade relations, subscribe to our channel.